Hello, this is James Fodor, the Godless Theist. Today I want to talk a little bit about the debate between William Lane Craig and Sam Harris concerning whether the foundation for morality is natural or supernatural. This debate was held in 2011, and I want to focus in this video predominantly on Craig's opening speech. Might talk about a little bit of his first rebuttal as well. I want to discuss some of his arguments against Dr. Harris's position, and also consider also some of the arguments that Craig puts forward in favour of his position, and I think some of the weaknesses for them. Now, I want to emphasise here that I don't want to come across as supporting sort of wholeheartedly what Harris has said about the moral landscape, because I do think there are problems with the account. I certainly think it's far from perfect. But I am broadly sympathetic with the account he's given, and I'll explain sort of why. And I think that the critiques that Craig raises, some of them are more valid than others, but I certainly think some of them aren't very good, and some of them he pushes much too far. And also many of them I think could also be applied to his own position. And I think this is a big issue where Harris and others fail, is that they fail to apply the same critiques that the theists levy against the naturalist or the atheists about morality. They fail to apply those similar critiques back to the theists' position when they could. Things like the is-ought distinction, but we'll get to that. So that's the focus of what I want to talk about. Okay, so let's make a start. So again, just to start off with, Dr. Craig, as he is wont to do, starts out his opening speech by defining what he means by objective moral values. He says that to say they're objective is to say that they are valid and binding independent of human opinion. Now, I actually don't think this is a very satisfactory definition, although this is more or less the one he usually gives. I don't actually know how much Dr. Craig knows about metaethics. He doesn't evince particularly strong knowledge in the debates and pieces that I've read. But if he did know about metaethics, and perhaps he does, he would know that there are a diversity of positions about the nature of moral claims. One set of positions is known as cognitivism, and the contrasting set of positions known as non-cognitivism. Now, this is important because cognitivists say that ethical claims or statements should be viewed as propositions, so they're asserting facts about the world. Whereas non-cognitivists say that talk of morality and right and wrong should not be understood, or is not best understood in propositional terms. It's best understood in some other terms. Like, for example, they could be injunctions, or they could be expressions of preference, or there are various ways that they could be understood. It's not clear here, although I think we can infer that Craig is adopting a cognitivist position. That is, he thinks that ethical discourse concerns propositions, statements of fact, about which there can be a sort of a truth or falsity. But he doesn't explicitly say that, so it's not clear whether it seems at least plausible that morality could be objective even though it wasn't propositional. Maybe we'd have to do a little bit of conceptual work to get that to fit, but I don't see in principle how we couldn't make sense of that. Obviously we'd have to understand what objective means in that sense. But all he says is valid and binding. I mean, the only thing that I know that can be valid in a formal, rigorous sense is an argument. That is, an argument is valid if the conclusion follows from its premises, and I don't think that's what he means here. So I don't really know what he does mean. Let me reinterpret what he's saying here and try to make some sense of it. I think what he's getting at is he is saying that objective moralities exist if, first of all, moral claims consist of a series of propositions, so he's proposing cognitivism, and second of all, at least some of those propositions are true independent of human opinion, or a human opinion of their truth value. So this would be a form of moral realism and also moral objectivism. So that, I take it, is Craig's thesis, that we have to have moral propositions, some of which at least are true, independent of human opinion. Now that, so as I said, that I'm going to take as his contention. That's what he's arguing, that cannot be the case if atheism is true. Now, particularly what he seems interested in this debate and elsewhere as well is not whether atheists can know what's right or wrong, because he says they can, or not whether they can do the good or versus bad, because he says they can do that as well. Rather, he's interested in what it is that makes, or that would make, some moral propositions true in an atheistic universe. He talks about the moral ontology, or the grounding. So I'm going to interpret this as the question, in virtue of what are such and such moral propositions true? So in virtue of what is it true to say that it is wrong to, rape or murder or something like that? I take it that that's Craig's question here, and I'm doing a little bit of reading between the lines to try and get at that. But I think that's basically what Craig is trying to get at here. I do think it would be better if he was a bit clearer about precisely what he's saying when he talks about vague things like valid and binding and grounding and things like that, which are a bit fuzzy, but I think that's what he means. Now, having established that groundwork, let's skip down to Craig's criticism of Sam Harris's articulation of an ethical framework. Basically, Sam Harris thinks that ethical statements are actually claims about what promotes the flourishing, physical, mental, and psychological flourishing of sentient beings. It's interesting that as far as I know, Harris doesn't restrict this to human beings, although Craig does criticize Harris for speciesism in preferring human beings to others, which I always think is odd, because there's no reason that most atheists would say that only humans have moral value. But anyway, that's another issue. What is Craig's fundamental problem with this line of argument? Now again, I don't think the way Harris articulates his point is quite sufficient. I think he needs to do more philosophical work than he does. But I think he's on the right track, broadly speaking, in my personal opinion. Now, Harris's views constitute what is called moral naturalism. And this is important to understand. Moral naturalism is a subset of moral realism. Remember, moral realism is the position that says that, first of all, value discussions of morality consist of sets of propositions. That's cognitivism. Secondly, realism says that at least some of those propositions are true, independent of human opinion. And then moral naturalism expands on that further and says something like that the truth of moral facts ultimately can be reduced to or understood in terms of, or grounded in, I suppose, as Craig would say, non-moral natural facts. That's a reductive moral naturalism. There are actually non-reductive forms of naturalism as well, but let's not try and confuse the matter here. Harris seems to be a reductive form of naturalist, which is just, he thinks that there are true facts that are reducible to non-moral facts about the natural world. So examples of those facts would be, for example, brain states, or the pleasure and pain, suffering and flourishing of sentient beings. Those would be non-moral. They're not sort of intrinsically moral in themselves. They don't use moral language, and they're natural. They're facts about the natural world, which include facts about humans and so on, but they're not facts about supernatural things, is the point. So that's Harris, as far as I know, doesn't use that language, but that's the position that he's taking. And this is where I think that Harris doesn't address enough of the philosophical argumentation around this, because it's true, as Craig points out in various ways, reductive moral naturalist views have been subject to a lot of criticism, as have every single metaethical view that's ever been discussed or put forward. They certainly do have quite a number of prominent followers and defenders in the literature, but that's another question. I want to emphasize, though, that it's not enough for Craig just to say, well, there are problems with this view, because, as I said, there are problems with every metaethical view. I think no serious philosopher would deny this, or no honest one anyway. The issue, I think, that should be the real question is how can we give a superior account of morality, the ontology of moral values, that is, in virtue of what are such and such moral claims true, independent of human opinion. And the way that Harris wants to answer that question is through a reductive moral naturalist explanation, to take moral claims and say, well, these actually mean, or these can be understood to mean sort of at a deeper level, refer to facts about certain natural, non-moral facts, like human flourishing, brain states, and so on. That's what a reductive moral naturalist thinks. Peter Railton is someone who is a philosopher who's argued for a reductive moral naturalism, and I'm quite influenced by his position. It's actually not that far off from Harris's. It's more philosophical in nature than scientific. This is, I think, also where Harris goes wrong in focusing on science too much. I don't actually think that that's that important to the philosophical account. Sort of obviously, once you've established a reductive moral naturalism, you're going to be able to use science to answer at least certain moral questions, but that's not really interesting philosophically. That's sort of a byproduct more than anything else, or that would be more an issue of practical ethics rather than metaethics. So I think that's a bit of a mistake. But anyway, so what I'm emphasizing here is that's the project that Harris is on. It's a reductive moral naturalism. Now let's see what arguments Craig puts forward as to why such a project is unsatisfactory or fails. What does Craig say in argument against a reductive moral naturalist framework? Okay, so let's look at what he says here. How does Sam Harris propose to solve the value problem? The trick he proposes is to simply redefine what he means by good and evil in non-moral terms. He says, quote, we should define good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures, end quote. So he says, quote, questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures, end quote. And therefore he concludes, quote, it makes no sense to ask whether maximizing well-being is good. Why not? Because he's redefined the word good to mean the well-being of conscious creatures, end quote. So the Craig goes on to say that Harris's account is just a tautology. He's playing word games and talking in circles. He's solved the value problem by redefining terms, Craig says. It's nothing but wordplay. And then Craig goes on to say that Harris is not really talking about moral values at all. He's talking about what's conducive to the flourishing of sentient life on this planet. Then he goes on to say that so Craig is saying that Harris has not provided any justification or explanation why moral values would objectively exist at all. His so-called solution is just a semantic trick of arbitrarily and idiosyncratically redefining the terms good and evil in a non-moral way. So fundamentally, Craig says that all Harris has done has redefined his terms, and he's not given any reason as to why he's done this, and he describes the redefinition as a semantic trick and as arbitrary and idiosyncratic. Now, is this a fair characterization? Now, I've read parts, but not all, of Harris's book. I don't think he provides a sophisticated or detailed philosophical argument as to why we should understand moral values in terms of, corresponding to the flourishing of sentient creatures or something like this. In other words, he doesn't give a detailed account, as far as I'm aware, of the philosophical reasons for thinking that moral values are, or moral language, moral claims, are actually statements about brain states and flourishing of sentient creatures. That's the analysis you need to give, I think, and that's the analysis I think someone like Peter Railton does give quite successfully. So in this respect, I do agree with Craig. The fact that Harris doesn't give one shouldn't surprise us that much. He's not really a philosopher, although some may disagree with that. But he doesn't really publish in philosophy journals, as far as I know. And so the fact that Harris hasn't provided one doesn't really mean that there is one. That does not imply that there isn't one, or one could not be constructed. And so I think Craig's a little bit arguing against a straw man here. It's not exactly a straw man, but it's certainly not the strongest form of the argument he could seek out, the atheist reductive moral naturalism. But anyway, what I want to focus on is Craig accusing Harris of just playing in circles and a tautology and word games and so on. Remember, the reductive naturalist says precisely that we can understand moral discourse, moral claims, in terms of non-moral statements. This is the position of reductive moral naturalism. It's not something that Harris has just made up on a whim, and so it's not idiosyncratic. It's a distinctive position, that's for certain, but it's a well-discussed, quite popular position. And Craig would, I think, in order to address it properly, need to discuss the literature about what people have said about these sorts of positions. I keep banging on about Peter Railton because he's one of the ones that's he's one of my favourite thinkers on this, but there are many others, of course, who've written on this. Jackson introduced a form of moral functionalism. I'm not sure if that's a reductive account. I think it might be. But there are many others as well. Heaps of philosophers have written on this question. So it's not arbitrary or idiosyncratic. I think it's particularly bizarre for Craig to say this is arbitrary. Do we really think it's arbitrary to define moral values in terms of the flourishing of sentient creatures? I mean, maybe you want to say that's not a satisfactory definition, or there are certain understanding, or there are certain problems with it, but can we really think that this is arbitrary? I mean, for some people this is just very intuitive and sort of obvious. In fact, you might even take it as axiomatic, and that's one approach. You could just say, well, this is just sort of a self-evident truth. This is a basic starting fact of our inquiry, that this is what we mean by moral, maximizing the flourishing of sentient creatures, or something along those lines. That's certainly a plausible route, and Craig doesn't really consider that. But even if that's not the route taken, there are various other accounts that can be given. Of course, we'd have to have some notion of how it is that we understand one thing in terms of another thing. So, for example, and this is a case that's been discussed in literature, why is it that we say that water is actually H2O? That when we talk about water, we're actually talking about the properties of H2O molecules and collections thereof. how is it that we can justify saying that one thing reduces to the other? And you might think that this is sort of obvious and irrelevant, but actually there are deep philosophical questions here about, identities and sharing of properties and sense and reference and understanding of reducing one entity to another. All sorts of issues there, which I don't have time to get into here. But the point is that merely because, well, Craig doesn't address any of those issues. But the other thing is that merely because there's some work to do, it doesn't mean that the entire notion of objective moral value or reductive naturalism goes out the window, because again the point is that there is this philosophical work needs to be done for any such claims of reducing one entity to another, including water to H2O. It's a very similar process. How can we say water is H2O? How can we say that moral values or moral truths actually state statements about the flourishing of sentient beings? Very similar philosophical problems in these cases, and I think it's not correct to say that Harris's position faces a stupendously different or particularly high burden here, or problem that it faces that is not faced by other issues as well, of reducing discussion of one entity to a discussion of another. And Craig doesn't really address this. He just says that it's deeply problematic that Harris is defining one entity in terms of another, but we do that all the time in discourse. And sure, there are philosophical issues, as I've just said, but those philosophical issues exist across the board. They're not unique to reductive naturalism. They're found in any sort of reduction of any one discourse to anything else. How can we justify that? How can you justify going from water to H2O? Well, similar problems are going to be faced going from moral values to reducing them to non-moral facts. But again, this position is discussed. It's a valid position in terms of the fact that it is widely discussed in the literature, and it's something that's seriously defended. And I think it's just disingenuous and inaccurate for Craig to describe it as just a semantic trick, or that it's arbitrary and idiosyncratic. I think that this is not an accurate representation of the position of reductive moral naturalism in the philosophical profession. So, having explained why I think Craig's wrong about his description of the status of Harris's account, that I don't think it's really that arbitrary or especially problematic, acknowledging that there are issues, and I haven't really given answers to those issues, I'm acknowledging them, whilst also saying that, first of all, they're not insuperable because we face them in other areas as well, and second of all, they're the things that we discuss in the philosophical literature. It's not as if Harris's positions have been universally rejected because of these concerns. But what I want to do now is look at what Craig's account of morality is and see if we can't perhaps apply some of the critiques that Craig makes of Harris back onto Craig's account. So let's see what Craig says about how he grounds objective morality ontologically in God. He says, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being and therefore the highest good. Indeed, he is not merely perfectly good, he is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature provides the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist wholly independently of human beings. And then he says that his views are God's views are expressed to us in the form of divine commandments. And then he says, far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature and his essential character, and so forth. Okay, so first of all, notice here, Craig later in the debate says that he's not making a semantical claim. He's not saying he's making a claim about what it means, what moral claims mean, or what they're about linguistically. But notice now what he says here. He says that God is by definition the greatest conceivable being and therefore the highest good. That is absolutely and very clearly a semantical claim. He says by definition God is ultimately good. That is a semantic claim. He is identifying God with ultimate goodness. So I think he's flatly contradicted himself here by saying that he was not making a semantic claim when he's referring to Anselm's definitional claim. He's saying that by definition God is good and therefore good is God. It's not clear whether he was saying that they're identical in terms of essence or whether God has the property of being ultimately good, but either way he is defining one in terms of the other in a very direct way. He seems clearly to be making a semantical claim. But let's move beyond this. Let's see what he does then. He says God is the locus and paradigm of moral value. Locus meaning the sort of place where something happens or where it exists. Okay. What does he mean by that? So God's own holy and loving nature provides the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. So that's not quite what Craig wants to claim, because providing a standard is not the same thing as providing an ontological foundation. Remember, a standard is just something by which you measure or make a comparison. But that doesn't mean that that's the ontological foundation of something, necessarily at least. A standard can be a purely practical device that, again, you use for making measurements or comparisons. That's in fact an epistemological claim. If God provides the standard against which something is measured, that says that that's how we find out if something is moral, but that doesn't say anything about the ontological foundation, the fact in virtue of which moral claims are true. So when Craig talks about God being a standard, that's really not relevant to the ontological status, which is what he's supposedly most concerned about. Now, what he says next is the most interesting part. He, God, is by nature loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Okay, now these are properties of God, presumably, and one can ask, yes, okay, so I accept God has these properties for the sake of argument, but does that mean he's good? In other words, it seems what Craig is doing is saying that God is good, or God has a good nature, because of these properties that he has, namely, he's loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. The implication is that if he did not have these properties, if he had the opposite properties, if he was hateful and spiteful and capricious and unkind and all of the other things, then he would not be good. So God's goodness is grounded in, understood in terms of, reduced to, you could even say, these further properties. But these properties here are not explicitly moral properties. I mean, they're related to moral properties, but for example, being generous or even being faithful and kind is not necessarily the same as being good, unless we sort of suppose beforehand that these are the same thing. This is not quite a reductive this is not quite a reductive account, I think, because it's a little bit unclear as to what he's trying to do exactly, but I think it's getting very close to one. Now, it's certainly not a natural account, because these properties are not exactly natural properties. It's not exactly clear what ontology they're supposed to have. They're supposed to be part of God's nature, yes, but if they're merely part of God's nature, it's unclear what it means to predicate them of God, that is, to say that God is loving. Now, for that to make any sense, we have to have a notion of what it means to be loving independent of God, because if the only thing we mean by is loving is, well, that's part of God's nature, then that's basically saying, if we unpack the semantics, that God is consistent with his own nature. And then we can, if this is what Craig is really saying, if loving and generous and faithful doesn't actually mean anything independent of God, it doesn't actually provide any semantic insight itself, if these predicates really only say what God is, then we can accuse Craig fairly, I think, of exactly what he accuses Harris of, namely that he's just redefining morality in terms of something else. This is what Craig's doing here. He seems to be redefining morality in terms of God's nature, or in terms of properties like loving, generous, and faithful. He's playing semantic tricks and word games and arguing in circles, everything he accuses Harris of doing. I think that it's perfectly legitimate to criticize Craig for doing this, because it's very unclear how he grounds his morality any differently, fundamentally, than how Harris does. So, let's just recap a little bit here. What exactly is the problem with Craig's grounding of morality in God, the way he describes it here? Well, apart from the fact that it's sort of unclear as to how it's supposed to work exactly, and one has to do a lot of inference, fundamentally the problem is that he does not escape any of the criticisms that he wields against Harris. He accuses Harris of merely redefining morality in terms of something else, which is, he says, idiosyncratic and arbitrary. Well, I could say the same thing about what Craig's doing. He's redefining morality in terms of either, there's two things that he could be doing, and I think it's unclear. One way he could be doing it is redefining morality in terms of God's nature. This is the greatest conceivable being by definition sort of thing, in which case we can say, well, that's arbitrary, that's idiosyncratic, and what reason is there for defining it that way? Remember, Craig criticizes Harris for not giving a reason as to why for what reason Harris identifies goodness with flourishing sentient beings. We can ask Craig the same question: what reason have you given for identifying goodness with God's nature, other than mere assertion? So that's one way Craig could go. The other way he could go is to say, well, no, it's not God's nature per se. It's certain properties that God has. I mean, they're part of God's nature, but we unpack it a bit more. We don't just assert that it's God's nature. We say it's God's nature because of these properties that God has, namely his loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so on. But this still faces the same problem. We can ask, yes, but Craig, you've just redefined goodness in terms of loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so on. We can still ask, in virtue of what are these the same thing as good, or why should we understand goodness in these terms? We can ask for an account of why he reduces moral values, or that why he associates the objective truth of moral claims to the properties of generosity and faithfulness and kindness and so on. Why not something else? Why does he identify it in this way? He's given an account of morality, understanding it in terms of these properties, but he hasn't given a reason as to why these properties should be understood. Why morality should be understood in terms of these properties. So exactly the same criticism that could be levelled against Harris could be levelled against Craig here. Whichever way he goes, whether he just stops at the brute nature of God and doesn't say anything further, or whether he does go further and uses these further predicates to describe God's nature, either way we can just ask why this account, what's your justification for it, and have you not merely played word games and redefining morality exactly as you criticize Harris for doing. Okay, so let's sum up a little bit. I have said, in essence, that, first of all, we should understand Sam Harris as presenting a reductive, moral, naturalist metaethic, which is to say that he thinks that moral claims are best understood in terms of, that is, they mean, we should understand that when we make moral claims, saying something is good, what we really mean is that this thing promotes the flourishing or well-being of sentient creatures. That's what Craig is doing here, is reducing moral claims to non-moral, to statements about non-moral states of affairs. Craig appreciates this, but many of his arguments do not really address this point. Rather, they simply assert that this is wrong. He calls this move of reductive naturalism idiosyncratic and arbitrary. He says that there's no reason given for it. I think that he's partly true here, because Harris hasn't given satisfactory reason for it. You do need to present a case for it, but certainly other philosophers have done so. Craig refers to the Isort gap, which, at least in some understandings of the criticism, is question-begging, because precisely that's what the reductive naturalist thinks they can do, is reduce one to the other. You have to say why they can't. You can't just assert that they cannot, because that's precisely the claim that they're making. Craig says that nature in itself is just morally neutral. Again, this is precisely what reductive naturalists deny, at least in a sense of it, because they're saying that there are states of affairs about the natural world which, sort of taken together, we pull these natural facts together and we find that actually these constitute moral claims. So a lot of Craig's criticisms are really question-begging. They assert the falsity of Harris's position, or assume it, without saying why. So what Craig needs to do is provide a reason as to why a reductive moral naturalist account cannot work, or does not work, or why it fails. He does do this at one point where he talks about the sort of the psychopath objection to the moral landscape. I think this is more a specific objection to Harris's account rather than reductive moral naturalism as a whole, but perhaps I'll discuss that in a future video. But at least in these other parts of his remarks, Craig does not really provide a reason for rejecting Harris's claim, I think, other than asserting that it cannot be true. Now, the second point that I wanted to make is that Craig's very own arguments for a divine command theory metaethic also fall prey to similar sorts of criticisms that he levels against Harris. So if we are going to assume that there's an is-or gap, or that there's some problem moving from is claims to ought claims, then we could just as easily apply these to claims about God's nature. So what if God has such and such a nature, or has made such and such commandments? Are these good? We need some account as to why you can make that leap. Otherwise we can just ask, well, so what? Just as Craig asks, yes, I understand that this is going to promote human well-being, but is it good? I can just as well ask, well, yes, I understand this is consistent with God's nature, but is it good? In both cases, an account needs to be given, it seems. Craig does not give an account. He just presupposes that this is obvious, that if God has such and such a nature, then this is good. He might even be asserting this definitionally. Again, this is a semantic point, but it's not completely clear as to how he's articulating that. So, and likewise, if Harris is going to be accused of arbitrary and idiosyncratic redefinitions and merely wordplay and arguing in circles, Craig can be accused of exactly the same problem. He seems to be defining morality in terms of God's nature or in terms of his commandments, or sort of both. And so if you were to ask, well, why are the things that constitute God's nature, by the properties that constitute God's nature good, it seems that what Craig would have to say is, well, it doesn't make sense to ask that question because that's what it means to be good. It means to be a property of God's nature. And therefore he could be accused of arguing in circles in the same way that he accuses Harris of doing. And likewise, I also argued that when Craig then tries to understand or ground God's nature in terms of properties like loving, generous, faithful, and so on, it seems that he's actually doing something very similar to what Harris is doing. He's reducing moral statements to non-moral predicates. In this case, not necessarily natural. It's not clear whether loving is a natural property, but it's something that's not in itself intrinsically moral necessarily. I would argue, at least, and therefore what he's doing is not so different to what Harris is doing. Harris is trying to reduce moral claims to statements about natural states of affairs. Craig is trying to reduce it to properties of God, non-moral properties, that is, generous and faithful and so on. And just as you could ask, well, are these non-moral states of affairs that Harris is using, are they really good? How do you bridge this gap between them? You could ask exactly the same questions for Craig. Are these properties good that God has? How do you know that they're good? Are they good just because they're properties that God has? That seems to be problematic. Or are they good independently of God? Craig probably wouldn't like that either. But likewise, what reason do we have for believing that they're good, and how do you bridge the connection between them? So I think that there's a really clear symmetry here. Okay, so hopefully that was somewhat clear. I know I repeated myself a little bit, but I think that the arguments are a little bit confused and complicated, so hopefully that was somewhat clear. This has been James Fodor, the Godless Theist. Thank you for listening.